In the past year I had a couple of opportunities to take the Nikon Z9 in my hands and take some bird pictures with it, and when I discussed with other people afterwards about the camera, many people were saying I'm like judging the camera too harsh or I'm too negative about the camera, and yeah, maybe they were right. So what I wanted to do now is give the Z9 a thorough test, and I've had it at my home for now about 3 weeks. I've shot well over 20,000 pictures with it and with 3 different telephoto lenses, so this review is all about bird and wildlife photography in general. And I just want to share my opinion. What do I like about this camera? And to be honest, there are also quite some points where I think the R5, which is way cheaper, still has the edge, and that's what this video is about. Let's start with the body and the handling of the camera, and this was one of my biggest complaints. It's really heavy. It's 1.34 kilograms compared to the 740 grams of the Canon R5, and the Sony A1 is in a very similar range than the A1. I think it's like 10 or 20 grams of difference, and this one feels heavy. Even compared to the Canon R3, which has an integrated battery grip, it's still 330 grams heavier. And since I hike a lot, this is something I definitely consider as a negative point, especially if I am working with 2 cameras, then this weight difference really starts adding up. Otherwise, it's also a big body. As you can see, you have an integrated battery grip. I know that many people prefer this. I've used separate battery grips for my cameras in the past, but I don't like that sometimes I want to go really low and then this is blocking me, especially if I'm taking pictures at a lake and like the shore is like not completely flat but slightly going down. Even with a big lens like the 600mm f4 attached, I had it a couple of times that I couldn't get as low as I wanted to, and I tried to clean it, but you can still see that there is actually some mud on the camera, so here I had a clear advantage with the R5. On the plus side, the Z9 seems like a really robust camera. Unfortunately, I could not really test this so well, just because there was no rain. There was some snow, but to be fair, snow is not really a real toughness test for a camera like this. And otherwise, what we can also see, as a lot of pro bodies do, it has a lot of buttons, which I generally like. And I want to go a bit more details in some of the buttons. So first of all, some of them are illuminated. As a wildlife photographer, I don't care for this too much, but of course if you do other type of photography, maybe astro or other night photography, this could be very cool. I also really prefer the on-off switch on the Z9 compared to the position on the R5, where it's a bit on the left side. And you have 3 buttons here that you can touch with your fingers when shooting. On the R5 you only have 1, and it's in a position that I find really hard to reach, whereas these here I can reach them easily. My only complaint is if I switch to vertical, there are no more buttons. For example, the R3 only has 2 buttons, but it has them in horizontal and vertical position. And here I can still reach the FN3 button, but the FN1 and 2, no way I can reach them when shooting vertically. So this means for me I cannot really put critical functions here if I can only use them in one of the orientations. And I also noticed while I can reach them really nicely like this, I had troubles when using gloves that I was accidentally tipping on them, and this was a bit a problem. So in the end I started to deactivate them when I'm using gloves and activate them when I'm not using gloves, but this was not the best. So why didn't I just use another button for the functions? Well, here is a problem with the Z9. You can customize a lot, but you cannot put every function to every button. And don't get me wrong, Canon is not better in this way. I think the only manufacturer that really allows this is Sony. There you can put every function more or less to every button that you want, and I would highly prefer this. Also on the R5 I have here 2 buttons that I can use for kind of back button autofocus or to put different autofocus modes. Here I kind of only have 1 AF on button. Not the biggest deal, but I would have preferred something else here. But what I really don't like is that you only have 2 main dials. Have 1 here on the front, 1 on the back, and then here you have this multi-controller, or however it's called with Nikon, that I find quite useless. I clearly prefer the 3rd wheel here on the R5, because this means I can change shutter speed, ISO, and the aperture all in one. Here, for changing the ISO, I always need to press a button, and this just slows me a bit down. I tried to put it on the kind of the control ring or function ring of the lens, but then here the problem is that if I have 3 different lenses, they're all at 3 different positions for some weird reason. And also I didn't like the haptic so much. I was just accidentally changing the settings. So I really wish Nikon would have put a third dial here. The camera takes 2 CF Express Type B cards, and for me that's the best combination out there on the market. The R3 or the R5 only take 1 CF Express and then a slow SD. The Sony A1 takes 2 CF Express, but they're Type A, so they're more expensive, have lower capacity and are slower. So congratulations Nikon, I think this was the best choice. The only thing I don't like, I find it a bit hard sometimes to open the card door. I've gotten a bit more used to it, and like this it's fine, but if I have the big lens attached, I really find it difficult, and sometimes I need to put it down to open it. Not a deal breaker, I'm not doing this so often out in the field, but this could have been a bit better. If we move down here, we have the battery, which is quite big, and I can tell you it feels like it lasts forever. So I've taken more than 20,000 shots with the camera, and I checked a couple of times. I had 5 to almost 7,000 pictures on one battery before I needed to charge it. Of course, during testing you take a bit more pictures than usual, but I was also going more in the menus and changing functions and buttons and this and that. So it's maybe not an accurate measurement completely, but it lasts way more than the R5 or any mirrorless camera that I ever had. In fact, I think the last time I had such a long battery life was when I was using a Canon 1DX. One small thing I noticed with the battery, you kind of need to detach this like outer part of the camera. Here I like the Canon version or implementation more, where this part is actually part of the battery. So if you have 2 batteries, you can just switch the battery directly without needing to mount and demount this tiny thing, but not a big deal. Let's get to the viewfinder and the display. First of all, the viewfinder is really big, so noticeably bigger than the R5. However, it has a bit less resolution. Is this a deal breaker? No, not at all. I'm still not 100% sure which of the viewfinder I prefer. If I prefer the higher resolution of the R5 or the size of the Z9, really hard to say, but it has something else which makes me love this viewfinder way more, and this is the like blackout free shooting. So if I shoot or pan and shoot with the R5, you have kind of this slideshow effect. So the viewfinder goes down to the 20 frames per second that the camera does, whereas here I think it stays in 120 frames a second or at least 60 frames per second. Anyway, you don't feel any type of slowdown, and this is not important if you take some pictures of ducks that are just swimming over the lake, but if you take pictures of a flying bird, especially one that is landing or starting, this means accelerating or decelerating or maybe changing the direction, this can really make a difference because you can track it much better. One thing that I noticed and didn't like so much was that the eyepiece, this like rubber ring, was coming off 2 or 3 times in my backpack. Maybe I'm just putting too much stuff in my backpack, this might very well be, but I've never had the issue with an R5 or 5D Mark IV. The display is also big and very nice to use. It comes like outside like this for horizontal shooting, and for vertical shooting it has an additional axis where you can take it like this. It's for me a bit more like cumbersome to take out compared to the R5. I assume it's also more robust. And what is nice that you are somehow closer to the optical axis of shooting, so it's easier to track birds, if this makes sense. If with the R5 you're in a weird position and you have it a bit like this, it's a bit harder to follow where the bird is going. This is definitely nicer with the Nikon. The only thing that for me personally is not so good is that I cannot flip it out like with the Canon to the front. Most of you will probably never need this, but for filming myself, for the YouTube videos, this is really nice for the R5. Let's move to the image quality. So the Nikon Z9 has a 45 megapixel full frame sensor, so similar resolution than the R5, but it's a stacked sensor. And this means that the readout is so quick that you have basically no rolling shutter. I need to say I'm kind of spoiled because the R5 is already quite good, so it has very little rolling shutter, but you still can see it in some occasions, so this just gives me a better feeling. And this is on par like with the Sony A1 or the Canon R3. But apart from the technology, how is the image quality? So I didn't do any comparison shots directly of the R5 and the Z9 in a studio setup. I use both in the field, sometimes side by side. And in terms of resolution, like sharpness and noise, dynamic range, they seem to be quite comparable. And you can see with this image, the noise is really not too bad. And more importantly, almost, if I use a software like Topaz Denoise, I can get rid of the noise very easily. So Topaz handles the files of the Z9 very good. And I still have all the details. And I need to say that I was shooting in the lossy compressed RAW. So for the Nikon, there are 3 RAW kind of quality settings. There is the lossy compressed low res, or small files, the lossy compressed with a higher quality, and then the lossless compressed. I chose the middle one, and still the files looked very nice. So if you want to test Topaz Denoise for free for 30 days, I put an affiliate link in the video description. Otherwise, what I noticed a bit was the colors are just a bit different of the R5 and of the Nikon. This was to be expected. Most of the cases there was not a big difference. Just when I was shooting in sunset or sunrise in backlit, I noticed that I prefer a bit more orangey colors of the R5 compared to a bit more greenish ones of the Z9. But also this, if you get used to it, you can just adjust this in post to your liking. So before we continue with the autofocus performance of the Z9, let me show you some images that I was able to take during this time. If you shoot wildlife, then I think autofocus is one of the key features of the camera. And we all had pretty high hopes for the Z9, I think, because Nikon was clearly lagging behind Sony and Canon. And the question was, can they deliver with the Z9? And overall, I need to say the autofocus worked good. But I also need to say the initial subject recognition was in many cases just much better with the R5 than with the Z9. So granted, I only had 2.5 weeks for testing the autofocus. I was asking a friend who's also shooting the Z9 for more than a year what he's using, and it turned out we were using the same settings. So I think they were not the worst starting point. It was most of the time the autofocus zone, the large one where you have animal detection enabled, and then I put the AF on button to switch to the 3D tracking. I also tried using the whole frame and switch to the 3D tracking sometimes, or using a smaller point. The bottom line is there were just situations where the R5 was just recognizing the subject way better. Once it was recognized, both cameras did an excellent job at tracking it. And then I tried to get to the bottom of it. In which situations was the R5 clearly better than the Z9? So I found that this was the case if the subject was like clearly defocused and if the background was rather distracting. So as an example, there were some reeds like 40 meters away from me. It was my camera, the Z9 was focused on this, and there was a seagull passing right in the middle between us, so 20-meter distance. I tried to focus with the Z9 and it would often not pick it up, no matter which focus mode I tried, whereas the R5 picked it up most of the cases, also not all the time. And I tried to illustrate this here with the screen recording of the Atomus, first with the Z9 and the 400mm f4.5, and you see it's really struggling to pick up the seagull. On the other hand, with the R5, most of the times it had no problem, and this was with the RF 100 to 500, also at 400mm focal length. What can definitely help here is to pre-focus, like either manually just changing the focus or using the memory set, the focus preset on Nikon cameras. These were two options. But I also need to say it was not a problem in all situations. So if I was just taking pictures of ducks that were swimming on the lake or other waterfowl, of some songbirds, I had zero problems. It was performing very similar to the R5. I was also shooting backlit. There I had the feeling it was almost a bit better if it was not directly in front of the sun. If it was directly in front of the sun, they did an equal terrible job, but this is to be expected. I never had a camera that was really good at that. And when I was shooting like in the morning light, backlit, but before the sun was going up, I had the feeling in these dark situations the Z9 almost had the edge over the R5. So overall, not a bad performance of the Z9, but in many situations the R5 just wins. Let's get to the frame rate and the buffer of the camera. So the camera can shoot 20 frames per second in electronic shutter, just as my R5. However, as I said, with the Z9 we have zero rolling shutter. And because of this, Nikon actually decided not even to put a mechanical shutter anymore. So there is no mechanical shutter, you can only shoot with the electronic one. And what they did very cleverly is when you shut off the camera, there is like a curtain coming down to like a protector from dust. So you can see this here, as soon as I turn it off, it goes down. And that's a very nice implementation. My R5 uses the sensor, as the shutter as kind of a sensor shield, but this has quite a delay. So you can see when I turn it off, this takes quite a while, and if really action is happening quick and I need to put an extender, which happens more with the Canon than with the Nikon because of the lenses that Nikon has, in this time I just want to switch and don't want to wait until the shutter is down. So that's very nice that the sensor is protected here. As I said, it shoots 20 frames per second. This is not a bad value, not at all. It's enough for me in probably 98% of the cases, for sure. However, I feel it's like falling a bit short in terms compared to the competition. So the Sony A1 is much older than this camera and shoots 30 frames per second. Now we have from Canon the R6 Mark II, which granted is newer but much cheaper, which shoots 40 frames per second. The R3, yes, I know it has less megapixels, but it has this crazy mode where it can shoot up to 190 frames per second for a very brief moment. But I'm just wondering, wouldn't it be possible via a firmware update to give us like the option to shoot 30 frames per second? Even if it's maybe constrained to 2 seconds or so, I think there are some situations where this could be useful. All this is just true for RAW. If you shoot JPEG, you can shoot up to 120 frames per second, but only with around 11-12 megapixels. So this was not so intriguing for me. And the camera also has a pre-burst, again, as many new Canon cameras do, but unlike the Canon cameras, the pre-burst only works in JPEG, which I find a bit, unfortunate. So 20 frames per second is still very nice, but now the question, how long can the camera maintain this? So here I need to say I only shot in the lossy compressed RAW, the higher quality, but not in the lossless. And in the lossy compressed RAW, I never had an issue. Now this might change if you shoot in lossless. I can just not give you any information here. Let's move to video, since this is getting more and more important for many wildlife photographers that want to take some quick clips in the nature aside. And here I think this camera really shines. It's a true hybrid camera. You can customize the buttons much more for video. It has some cool features like that you can switch to a crop mode with one press of a button. Also it has this slow autofocus that my R5 also has, that it's like slowly following a subject and not too quickly changing. But with the press of one button I can accelerate the autofocus again. Very nice features for video. I can shoot, of course, 120 frames per second, 4K, 60 frames per second, 8K, which I don't use, but it's a nice feature. And I think this sums it up. I don't use the video as much as it would be worth with this camera. So I just can highlight what I liked, but there are so many things that I just could not even use. So I think here the camera, the Z9, really shines compared to the competition. So I've been talking quite a lot now. What are my conclusions? I think the Z9 is a really nice camera for wildlife and bird photography. However, I think the R5 provides the better value. It's much cheaper, it has better autofocus, image quality is comparable, frame rate is the same. You just don't have the full package, so sometimes you might have a tiny bit of rolling shutter, you have a bit this lag in the viewfinder. But I think this is a bit the problem that I have now with the Z9. It's a nice body for high-end, but I would wish that Nikon would take a lot of the kind of the features and the specs that they have from this camera and put it in a smaller body. Let's call it a Z8 or Z7 Mark III that has a form factor of a R5 and comes with 95% of the features of the Z9, maybe not all the video features. I think this would be very good for at least the people like me that prefer a smaller and lighter body and also a bit a cheaper one. For the other things like that, I would wish that all buttons could be assigned with every function. I hope this still comes via firmware update. Maybe Nikon also manages to still improve the autofocus a bit via firmware update. So I was using the firmware 3.0 with this camera. We will see how it develops. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. And please visit soon again if you're interested in Nikon stuff. I'm still working on my review for the Nikon Z400mm f4.5.